Hey guys, welcome back. Again, as always, I miss you. I wish I could see you every day, but that's not the case as of right now. So we're just going to get started with some lecture here before you guys jump in for the rest of what's going to happen this week. Now, there's something we covered in class at the beginning was I gave you a project where you guys did some different species of birds, some different bird types. You went over where they come from, what they look like, and we went over this idea that they have many different sizes, they come in many different shapes, they have many different environments, they pretty much live wherever and however. And my question to you is, how does that happen? How does that occur? What's the driving force there? What's the mechanism that makes this a reality? How do we have so many different types of birds, different sizes, and what else have you? Well, the main idea here, or the main theory here, is evolution. Evolution is why we have so many different species of birds. It's why we have so many different species in general. Now, keep this in mind, a little preface before we get too far into this. I am not here to down on any of your beliefs or ideas, religion or otherwise, okay? I'm just here to explain what science believes, where everything came from, okay? Cool. Now, before we get too far along here, let me pull this up because I was not... Okay, here we go. Now, before we get too in-depth with the mechanism here, I kind of have to give you guys a brief history lesson here before you guys can understand this entirely. Now, there's a few individuals I want to talk about before we talk about the main head honcho himself, which some of you guys may already know. The first guy we're going to talk about is... Charles Lyell. He played a role in the evolutionary theory. He came up with this idea of uniformitarianism. Okay. He had this idea of a uniformitarianism. Charles Lyell was known as a geologist. Basically, what this means is that geologic processes happen in a uniform rate or an even rate. I'm going to shorthand all this because I'm lazy. Okay, so Charles Lyell was a geologist. He came with this idea of uniformitarianism. What that means is that geological processes, meaning that rocks being made, rock layers, they all happen at an even rate. It just doesn't happen or just jolt and there it is. Okay. He proposed this idea that Earth was millions of years old instead of a few thousand, which was believed at the time that he was alive. Okay, and as we all know, Earth is essentially 4.6 billion years old, so even he was a little bit off. Okay, and now that's what he came up with, and we're gonna come circle back to this guy and see why he was important after a little bit. I'm gonna change my marker here, and we're gonna talk about John Lamarck, or Jane Lamarck. Spell his name right here, or John Lamarck, whatever you want to call him. Okay, John Lamarck. He was born in 1809. Not sure if that's important. He came up with this idea that change happens over time. So as you can see, he was drawing upon ideas from Charles Lyell here, is that geological processes happen over time, and they don't just jolt and there it is. He came up with this idea that changes to biological creatures and biological species happens over time. It just doesn't, boom, there it is, okay? That sort of thing. Now, he was a little bit off. He came up with this idea that organisms adapted and changed Okay, he came up with this idea. He stated that changes are adaptations to the environment. They're acquired in an organism's lifetime. This is where he was just a little bit off. He wasn't necessarily correct here. Okay, he said acquired changes were passed to offspring. So as this thing adapted over time, it would pass it on to its young, which he was technically a little bit off on. Oh, sorry, moving the camera on. He came up with this idea, which was technically off, but I'm going to give it to you anyways. The law of disuse. Okay? Basically, it comes down to the idea of if you don't use it, you lose it. So basically, this law basically comes up with the idea of if you use a body structure or organ, it got stronger, sort of thing. If you did not use it, it deteriorated. It didn't become useful anymore. It just basically went away. And the idea being is the idea of, I guess the example I can give is the giraffe. He came up with this by looking at sort of different types of species. He came up with this idea that giraffe's neck wasn't long to begin with. And then as it adapted over time, trees got taller, ergo it kept using its neck, so it kept getting longer and longer and longer. Ergo, it was getting stronger, quote unquote, over time. And that's not necessarily the way things actually work out today. But we're going to see that as we move along. But he came up with this, a very important idea is that change happens over time. It doesn't just jolt and there it is. Okay? So just kind of playing off this a little bit more, organisms could change the size and shape of organs by using them or not using them. So basically, over time, he came up with this idea, if you use your arm enough, or if you lift it enough, it'll get bigger and huge and compared to, say, I don't know, your neck. If you're just not using it, it would just simply go away, which isn't exactly the case. Or another example, blacksmiths and their son. Blacksmiths have muscular arms, they're just huge. He came with this idea that they would pass them on to their young, which isn't necessarily the case. Direct snaps, snakes lost legs because they were not using them, use and disuse. Again, this isn't necessarily the case for modern ideas. Okay. Now, some of his mistakes, things that he could not figure out or prove. Okay, he could not, or he did not know. He did not know how traits were passed. He didn't understand how traits were inherited. And what I mean by a trait is it's a physical trait about you. Your height is a trait, your weight is a trait, your eye color is a trait, your hair color, that's all traits, okay? He didn't know how traits were inherited or passed on, okay? And he couldn't figure that out, and he didn't know that genes or your DNA are not changed by activities in life. In other words, if you're sitting there and you're lifting a bunch of weights and you all of a sudden get ripped, it's not going to change your DNA to pass that sort of gene on to your young, okay? What you do in your life isn't necessarily going to be passed on to your young, okay? He did not know that changes to DNA are caused by mutations to your DNA, okay? Cause it to change. Obviously, if it changed your DNA, then your young will be changed as well. Okay? Let's keep going here. He came up with the idea that evolution does play a role somehow. He came up with this idea, but he couldn't really figure out how it worked. Okay? There's one other dude I want to talk about, and that is Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus wasn't even really a scientist. He was a mathematician or an economist. Okay, he came up with his ideas in 1798. He was basically looking at population growth. Okay, so he observed that he came up with this idea that babies, human babies, he observed that babies were being born faster than they died. Okay? He came up with this idea that population size is limited by resources, food supply, that sort of thing. Okay? So he came up with this idea that it's limited by resources. Okay? Population, that is. So he came up with this idea that population were limited by resources, food, and all that good stuff. Okay? So he came up with this idea that populations could essentially continue to grow unchecked sooner or later until it reached a certain point. Once it reached a certain point, there'd be insufficient living space, there'd be insufficient amounts of food, and then the population would start to decline a little bit in that idea. Okay. So basically, he came up with this idea that eventually population would just keep rising, and then eventually we'd run out of food, or the food supply would start to dwindle off, and then death rate would increase to balance population size. He came up with this idea. Can you guys read that? Okay, there we go. My bad. And food supply. Okay, and he came up with this idea that he came up with this idea naturally. He came up with this idea by studying populations. He came up with this idea that populations are essentially human growth, animal growth. They all basically, organisms get born. Their population just keeps growing and growing until something happens to where either space, food, other things that we're going to talk about later, cause the population of that species, whether it be dogs, cats, humans, cause that species to start to peter off, and then the population starts to decline due to limited amounts of resources. Okay? Now, this is a brief history lesson into some of the back work before we start talking about Charles Darwin, which is what we're going to talk about in our next lecture. Okay? But we need to understand these individuals because they played a role. Charles Lyell came up with this idea of uniformitarianism, which is a geological process that happens. That geological process on Earth just happened over time. John Lamarck used that idea. He adapted it to life on Earth, and he came up with some ideas. This idea of law of disuse, which he came up with this idea that if you don't use it, you lose it, or if you use it, it becomes stronger, which we know isn't necessarily the case. And he couldn't figure out how traits were inherited or passed on, which we know now that DNA has to be mutated for you to change. Okay, and then we come over here to Thomas Malthus, who was an economist who came up with this idea that populations will continue to grow unchecked until resources or limited amount of resources starts to kick in. Okay, and again, that's kind of where I want to leave it off for right now. Just give you guys sort of a history lesson before we start getting into the science and talking about Charles Darwin. Okay. All right. Until next time, see